Welcome to High Noon, where we talk about controversial subjects with interesting people. And my guest this week is Justin Lee, who's an associate editor at First Things Magazine, as well as a horror writer, which is by far the most interesting thing anyone has ever said about themselves to me at one of those like conservative rubber chicken dinners that organizations have. But I wanted to bring him on to talk about the connections between sort of this right wing scene developing and art, and what the future of that kind of art scene might be, as well as the publication of a controversial, apparently, article in First Things, for which I think he was probably responsible. But I want to start out by asking you, so for people who aren't following this particular corner of the internet, right? What is going on with this burgeoning sort of right wing art scene? It's a lot of Twitter anons, it's a lot of folks finding each other on the internet, but also a lot of real creation of art. And it seems like a very intentional step into the breach left by this sort of dullness of the woke
Mhm.
mainstream art scene. So what's the 10,000 foot view of what's going on?
Yeah, I think the 10,000-foot view is that um, there there are a lot of people with real talent who have been shut out of legacy institutions in one way or another. And if you're really an artist, you're going to make art, whether you're told you can or not. And in best case scenario, that art will find its audience. And so I think we're seeing just, what happens naturally when you do have talented people who are put in, an outsider situation. And so to some extent, this is, just a lot of outsider art finally beginning to um, coalesce and find an audience. But there's another element as well, though, where you have, um, quite a few people who have had success, in legacy publishing, for example, who are, um, just have this sense of claustrophobia right now within legacy world because of the woke stuff, and don't feel that they have the freedom to say what they want to say, write what they want to write, and so they're looking for other avenues. And so there is there's this weird coalescence of you know, former legacy people and newer people who don't have an existing audience beginning to come together and start different projects. And it's all very early. It's all very nebulous, but I think it's exciting and hopeful.
So one potential sort of model for this was laid out by Michael Anton in I Am
Hmm.
1776, right? He called it the Tom Wolfe model. And he points out that, Tom Wolfe, his work is now considered right of center and almost certainly was when he was writing it. But he really resisted that label, and made it just about making fun of the avant-garde of his time for the most part, right?
Hmm.
Um, on the left, and that connected with people because he was a brilliant writer and hilarious. Um, so Anton proposes basically this is probably a way forward. But then he points out that Tom Wolfe had institutional support, right? He had
Hmm.
somebody pay him to go around the country observing different
Yeah.
subcultures and groups and then write about them. So I have two questions for you about the Tom Wolfe model, I guess. One is, where is this institutional support going to come from? Because it seems like it is to some extent necessary. Yes, the artist will always create art,
Hmm.
but patronage is not a new idea. Um, and then the second thing is satire kind of enough, right? Because it's true what Anton wrote that it's the left is sort of it's a fertile ground for a smart and funny writer, for example, to make fun of. Um, but do you think there has to be some kind of positive component to this, or do you think that we can just get away with making fun of the left because they've made themselves such easy targets?
I think it has to be both. I don't think you can really have one without the other at this point. If it's merely satire, and if it's merely parody and lampooning, then I mean that gets old very quick. You can't simply be against. You have to be for something, and that this has become kind of um, a sub mission statement of First Things lately. That we generally want to avoid againstism, and everything needs to be counterbalanced with a positive vision. And um, so one of the ways that I think about this is I use the cultural theorist Philip Reef, who his most famous book is The Triumph of the Therapeutic, and just a fantastic indictment of um, the therapeutic culture and how it developed and what its consequences are. And he has another book, a little bit lesser known. It's partially a memoir, partially a kind of aesthetic manifesto called "My Life Among the Deathworks," and he's dissecting cultural works um, that serve the purpose of tearing down the normative order. So one classic example of this is I forget the so-called artist's name who made this, but the work was called Piss Christ, and it was a crucifix turned upside down in a beaker of the artist's urine. And and this was supposed to be some big profound statement, because he is shocking sensibilities, all that. It's obviously not art, but it's doing a kind of work that is um, to use blasphemy to murder cultural norms, and shift the Overton window in certain ways. And so we see the death works as kind of um, those things that bring about anti-culture and defiance of culture. And I think Deathworks used to be pretty interesting in some ways, back when there was a normative culture to deconstruct. But now that the deconstructors have succeeded, their works are, they're just tepid. There's no life in them. There's nothing interesting happening. And so the way I see, a productive dissident arts movement operating right now is through death working the culture of death. So satire and lampooning the new norms of the anti-culture performs a similar death work function, but it actually helps pave the way for work that can be life-giving. And so I see you have kind of two main jobs right now. If you're a dissident artist, and that's to destroy woke culture, to destroy therapeutic culture, and using your art. And so that means a kind of death working for that culture, and to build to do works that are true art and clearly point people towards the true, the good, and the beautiful. But there does have to be a certain amount of destruction that takes place to create room for the other work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does, and I'm reading Triumph of the Therapeutic right now, so maybe I'll move on to Deathworks afterwards because I'm finding the Triumph just an incredibly prophetic description of where
Hmm.
we are. But and it's funny to me because actually I find, as much as I like Christopher Lash, like I actually find this more uh a better description in many ways, or like at least, and I know that they
Sure.
have a lot of similar themes, but this is a little older for people who haven't read it. In any case, it struck me when you were saying, when you're talking about Piss Christ, the I think it was a photograph, right? Um,
Yeah,
I
you could
think it
actually go see it in a museum as well.
yeah, it came out in the '80s, right?
Mhm.
Uh, so it's interesting. At least it had that function that you know, sort of hinted at, right? Which is that it did genuinely shock people's sensibilities. I think you called it using blasphemy to, you know, so you didn't call it art, but it did, you know, uh, do some kind of work, and it was legitimately in some way transgressive because in 1985 or 87, right, it was still legitimately shocking to do what he did. Um, and it strikes me that something today, I think you're right, has very little power at all, even destructive power, because it's simply no like they've reached the end of the line. There are no more norms for them to really transgress against. And the best example of this, I think, is not an artwork, but a building in Manhattan. There's an old church that was turned into I think in the 80s and 90s, turned into a nightclub and then particularly a gay nightclub.
Mhm.
And that was obviously done uh, as an act of transgression, right? We're gonna
Mhm.
put like a gay nightclub in a church, and it had
Yep.
that kind of transgressive, even if people were horrified by it, it like had that transgressive kind of spark where people were like, "Oh wow," and people who loved it, and people who hated it, and it actually did create um, sort of there is some sort of frisson there. I can't pronounce that
Mhm.
word, but whereas now it got changed into the nightclub closed. It ended up being a gym for a while, and now a pizza place. And I think that's just a perfect trajectory of how basically it's lost even the edge because there's nothing transgressive about it anymore. Now
Mhm.
it's just a place to grab a slice of pizza.
Yeah.
Um,
No, I mean, if you want, gay dancing, you can go to any progressive church, in the city, and you're, liable to find drag queens performing on Sundays. It's yeah, it's really hard to be transgressive in that direction. Um,
very easy to be transgressive in the opposite direction
yeah,
in a certain sense.
yeah, yeah. Just by being normal and trying to be healthy is becoming an act of transgression. Um,
I wonder how it would be received, if somebody suspended the gay pride flag in a canister of urine and took a picture of it.
we could find out. Um, we know exactly how it would be perceived. It would be, um, it would be treated incredibly harshly. The person who did it would be unpersoned, rapidly and with as much vehemence as could be mustered. And it would be significantly, it would be a significantly stronger response than what happened to Piss Christ. Because even in the 80s, it had some frisson to it, but it was largely something you could yawn about. It was like, yeah, these people are going to do their thing. And, the church certainly didn't have the kind of cultural power in the 80s to really punish anyone for doing that kind of a performance. Whereas, the regime now absolutely has the power to, um, unperson someone who, urinates on a pride flag.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure
And,
that's a hate crime.
oh,
Like,
yeah.
actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm pretty sure that would be considered like you might actually get prosecuted in depending on the context, because there was somebody who dragged down a pride flag in front of some restaurant in the middle of the night, and I'm pretty sure she is now being prosecuted.
Hmm. And as a hate crime, not just as
Yeah,
vandalism.
yeah.
Wow.
I'd have to
Yeah,
look into the
it's
details of that case, and I don't know, but just from headlines. Let's return for a moment to the more perhaps not as interesting, but at least equally important question of patronage.
mhm,
How do we build new institutions that will provide the kind of paycheck that Tom Wolfe was able to enjoy, or at least the kind of legitimacy within I guess you could call it dissident circles, right?
Mhm.
Especially if you're showcasing people who haven't put their art into the public before. They don't have a natural audience until an institution sort of grants them one. I mean, are those kinds of institutions being built? I mean, how far are we from somebody who wants to do art that transgresses against the norms of our culture being able to find the kind of patronage that left wing artists do?
Yeah, we have quite a ways to go. It's still very early. Some institutions are emerging. You mentioned IM 1776 earlier, and they've just shifted their focus to doing this very thing, to providing patronage and platforming, um, dissident writers. And I know they've just received a big chunk of funding to help do that. So there is some donor interest in making this happen. And I know we're going to get to the Longhouse article shortly, but the author of that article, Lomez, is launching a publishing company that on off of the success of the Passage Prize, which was an anthology competition that he set up on Twitter and got a lot of participation and a lot of interest in, and um, and his publishing project is um, very close to getting the funding that it needs to have a really big first year. And and this is actually, I believe, unlike 1776, it's a for-profit venture, and so these aren't just donors; it's investors, who see um, real opportunity in this nascent movement. Um, so what it's going to take is, I guess, individual patronage and institutional patronage to support writers and creators, in the creation of the work. Um, but then the even bigger thing is, we need our own publishing houses. We need our own art galleries. We need our own theaters. We need our own production companies, and we need our own distribution platforms. Because the big problem that a lot of the stuff we'll run into is distribution, because there's absolutely an audience for it. If any big five publisher um, found the new Tom Wolfe, um, he or she would sell like crazy. Um, and but it's just the question of, do they have the willingness to take that risk, that reputational risk, to tap an obviously existing audience. And right now, they're largely cowards. Um, and especially if it's a new writer with no platform at all, it's just not going to happen. And especially if that writer's male, um, which is just how the industry's working right now. Um, but if we can solve that distribution problem, then I think the whole thing is viable. But we have to keep in mind that it's not an easy problem to solve, because this stuff can't just happen digitally. These can't just be really good ebooks. It has they have to it has to be physical objects that are beautiful, that you want to have, that you want to hold, and and give to people, show to people. Um, this is something that Lomez understands pretty well, and you see this with this first Passage Prize anthology. Um, the hardback sold for $400 a piece. It's very lavishly produced. He only printed 250 copies, so it's scarce, and they all sold out. almost immediately. And so this shows that there is a viability. That there are people who are actually very invested in the idea of this kind of work being made and are ready to support it. Um, but distribution is going to be, I think, maybe one of the biggest problems that we have to overcome.
So another problem that I can see needing to be overcome is how to sort of orient these institutions so as to avoid, because there have been attempts like this, but not. I think this one has a lot more chance, a lot more hope than some of those others. But
Mm-hmm.
there have been attempts to fund conservative art, but they have
Mm-hmm.
always come at it basically with a very heavy-handed political messaging,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That
It's,
has
and
made
so
it
it's not art.
boring, and usually it's not very good art.
Mm-hmm.
How do you avoid, like, how do for example, if you're an institution, if you're Lomez picking from entries for the Passage Prize, or um, if you're in a foundation and you're choosing artists to support, to patronize, to give the platform to, how do you evaluate, basically, how do you fit politics into the way that you evaluate it, right? Because obviously you don't want to publish, like Lomez would never publish
Mm-hmm.
some woke piece of art with like the New York Times stretchy heads and blank faces. Like he would immediately see that. But some things are more subtle. I mean, how do you keep sort of the it among quote unquote our guys, and make sure that you're actually supporting that side of the artistic community that isn't getting the support from the
Mm-hmm.
mainstream institutions, but at the same time not actually just directly injecting politics and saying, okay, here's a list of things you must believe if you want to submit art to the Passage Project. You understand what I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying?
Yeah, I mean, it's this early on. It's very easy to tell who's who and who is who's potentially worthy of investment, and because at this point it's just easy to spot who's not playing the game, who's not playing the by progressive rules, and because they're often already canceled or they're pre-canceled, um, and they've already um, they're very typically already out, and you know behind closed doors, people who are still in the closet, so to speak, are very often reaching out to the people who are much more publicly um, present with their beliefs and still trying to make art. And so there are already networks that exist informally for identifying people. And so if you talk to Lomez, or if you talk to Alex Perez or Mark Granza, like they just have a whole network of people that they know, who are trying to make art, and those people know people. Um, so what this tells me is that if you're a donor looking to be involved in patronage, you very well may not be um, in a position to make good judgments about what is significant art or what is good writing, etc. You might be able to recognize things that you like or things that seem to connect with your politics, but you just might not have the training or the cultivation quite yet to to have that kind of discernment. But there are a lot of people who do, and identifying people who do have discernment and empowering them to make decisions um, on your behalf in order to extend patronage. I think that would be the wise way to go forward.
Yeah, that brings me to another question I had, which is about the apparent cultural gap between what is being produced as dissident or right wing art and, let's say, the average Trump voter in America, um,
Mhm.
and whether this movement would be I guess I'm asking really a question about the relationship between sort of being avant-garde or newness, um,
Mhm.
and art generally, because it seems like I'm not of the opinion that like I'm not an elitist in this sense. I
Mhm.
There was a time in this country where art was aimed at a much more general audience, and I don't think that that made it worse art. In fact, the modern sort of left wing avant garde scene shows how esoteric you can
Mhm.
become when you're dependent only on grants and you're only trying to impress, two critics in two
Mhm.
magazines.
Or just
And
other
sometimes,
artists.
yeah, and like not connecting, not creating art that connects with the average person. But on the other hand, there seems like a pretty big gap between some of this art and what, like, I don't know, your average Trump voter is probably like looking for or wants to see or read.
Um, yeah, I think that there's some truth to that, but I also think that um, your average Trump voter probably isn't reading a whole lot, and for a myriad of reasons. But one of the biggest ones is that fiction is very rarely written for them. You're right about that. That this has been kind of an epical change in in who writers are writing for. Um, but this has been true for decades at this point, and there is this radical disconnect between you know um, literary literature and genre literature, um, and the former tends to be very navel gazing and self satisfied, and the latter. Even when it is infiltrated by woke nonsense, simply by virtue of being genre, it's committed to plot, it's committed to compelling narrative, compelling characters, and it's committed to having stakes, that are clear, which means that it's much more likely to resonate with normal people, because it's actually getting at things that are much more eternal and that aren't simply of the moment. Um, the traditional narrative arc is what it is for a reason, because it speaks to something very deep in the human soul. And when fiction tries to eschew that, it's there's always a cost. And but the other element to this, though, is um, and this will start to get us into the Longhouse thing. That the publishing industry is has been run by women for decades, and even when there's been nominal male leadership, um, it's been governed by the demands of a very feminine market. So between 70 to 80% of readers of literary fiction are women. About 80% of all the editors and agents in New York are women. And, and so this has an impact on the sensibilities of the work that gets published and the kinds of writers that get chosen. And this has been true, this didn't just now happen. This has been true for decades. And it's just become much more extreme over time. Um, but for decades, the message to the average, the normal reader in America, um, is that books are for women, and in particular, fiction is for women. So you see this huge gender divide between readers of fiction and nonfiction, and the divide breaks down by genre as well. You have very few men reading literary fiction, even old literary fiction. They gravitate towards science fiction, towards fantasy, towards horror, um, and I think that this is, I think that this is a very unhealthy situation that we've found ourselves in. I don't think that the gender divide should be what it is.
Um, that's definitely true even with regard to sort of childhood books. There's almost nothing being written in a modern sense that would attract boys to reading, it
Hmm.
seems like. There's very and especially there's very little assigned, right? You don't have Ivanhoe assigned in
Hmm.
class anymore, right? You have like House on Mango Street, or what was the one by Amy Tan about the four generations of women? I can't remember already.
Hmm.
Because it wasn't good.
Joy Luck Club.
Joy Luck Club. Um like you don't have these sort of adventurous themes in books that would attract boys to reading at all.
Hmm.
So that the content seems to be very feminine skewed, even what's assigned at school and so on. Um, so let's talk about the Longhouse article, right? Because so first things published a few weeks ago. We've mentioned Lomez a few times already, but he is anonymous Twitter account that goes under the name Lomez. That's not his real name. Um, and people seemed very upset that First Things, a Christian magazine, had published someone of this sphere. And that's really what it seemed to be, because the article itself, even though it uses that sort of very online buzzword Longhouse, I mean, the article itself, I mean, Heather McDonald wrote something quite similar about universities being
Hmm.
dominated and being by women and becoming feminized in their responses, for example, to student hysterics, right?
Hmm.
When a student says that they're offended, there's this sort of feminized bureaucracy that responds not by just telling them to get over it, but by trying to respond to those concerns and bend over backwards. So, and that's City Journal, right? That's a very
Hmm.
mainstream Manhattan Institute publication. So
Hmm.
I find it hard to believe that it was the content of what was published so much as the gall you had to publish one of these sort of anonymous art scene
Hmm.
Twitter anons. So what do you think of, first of all, what was the reaction? I mean, how did you experience the reaction from Patrick Deneen and others? So there was a lot of
Hmm.
pushback against it. Why did you publish this article in First Things? Um, and then what do you think? Why do you think it was important, I guess, to publish something like this in a established Christian magazine?
Yeah. So for a number of reasons, the biggest is I think that it taps into something that is very true and that needs to be discussed, and that we need to have debate about. And I think that it's, something that is, very clearly worth our readers' time. And a lot of people have come to similar ideas in different forms, like this recent McDonald piece, but even in the New York Times, Thomas Edsall, who Lomez quotes in the article, wrote an enormous piece on this a few years ago. That's very, very well researched, and showing the extent to this phenomenon, but of course offering no judgment. Just purely descriptive. And of course, First Things has written on this. We've published on this in the past. We just didn't call it the Longhouse. um, and but but for younger audiences, especially people who are really online, they're going to be familiar with this term, or they will have come across it. And and it has a lot of resonance. It people really connect with it, and so it's something that our readers need to be aware of. That here's this potent metaphor for this thing that we in a presented differently, we would all acknowledge, yeah, this is a real thing. Um, but here's the metaphor that has gained the most traction, in relation to this problem. So it's something our readers should know about. but publishing it also sends a message to, anonymous land that, that an establishment institution like First Things recognizes their validity, that there are real ideas that are meaningful, that are potent, and worth engaging, coming from outside of the conservative mainstream. And that's a so yeah, some people pushed back, but the the reception in that world was overwhelmingly positive. And you just had this sense of gratefulness that, oh, they're taking us seriously, and that's a good thing. Doesn't mean we need to take everything that comes from that corner of discourse um, with the same level of seriousness, but we need to recognize what's well thought, what's well thought out, what's deeply considered, and particularly what is resonant, and engage it intelligently.
How do you think
Um,
this is? Oh, go ahead.
oh yeah, I was just going to say regarding the pushback. There was pushback from people like Deneen, who didn't read the piece when he had commented on it, which I know with certainty, and that was the case for most people. So it was almost purely about the fact that we use a term, that was popularized by Bronze Age pervert, and because we published an anonymous guy, who's a internet flamethrower. Um, but you know, if you look at the response to Deneen on Twitter, not just coming from the anonymous quarters, but coming from a lot of mainstream voices, he got absolutely thrashed for that for that tweet. Um, the reaction was resoundingly, this is an idiotic position. It's mere gatekeeping for the sake of gatekeeping, um, and it's beneath someone of his intellectual caliber. And behind the scenes, the magazine has gotten this outpouring of support, um, and gratitude from people, especially men, who who've said something to the effect in their emails of, um, "This is what I've been experiencing, but haven't had the words to articulate. Thank you for publishing this."
So I feel like we've been dancing around what the Longhouse actually is, and this is an article called "What is the Longhouse?" I believe,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So what is the Longhouse? Because I sort of blew past that, just because probably from being very online, I just am
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
used to the terminology. But so what is the Longhouse? How does it relate to this sort of increasing proportion of various industries being female dominated? Because Lomez, for example, has a great line in there where he write in the article where he says, this is not only enforced by women. So it's not a
Hmm.
mere the longhouse is not a mere like sort of numerical accounting of who's in what job.
Right. Yeah. Although that can help us understand it a bit. Um, but yeah, but it's basically um, the general trend over the past several decades of making a kind of feminine, or I guess feminized phenomenology, the cultural norm in many significant spheres. And and this is, I think, most consequential um, in domains that used to be characterized by more masculine values related to competition. And so the way that men and women compete and handle conflict, is different. Men and women are not the same. We are different and important and typically complementary ways. And I think certain domains of public life, um, are better served by certain masculine predispositions. So, in the business world, hierarchy and conflict, that proceeds from competition is very valuable. Drives innovation, and um, and if you have a more feminized sensibility that is opposed to overt hierarchies and overt competition, and prefers things to be done, um, subtly, and with a more surface level egalitarianism. Um, that doesn't necessarily serve innovation in certain contexts, and so we're kind of downstream of a lot of those effects. So one way to think about the longhouse is, um, the the normalization of or I'd say the supremacy of a feminized sensibility, within domains that, are better served by, pure gender neutrality or even, a masculine sensibility. And, Lomez talks about, the way this contributes to, safetyism and cancel culture, and just the entire complex of woke pathologies, that afflict our culture. And I think that's right. And to draw things back to Reef, um, we can just refer to the Longhouse as, um, the therapeutic culture, writ large. It's just another term for what Reef is getting at. And, um, having said that, that means it's important to know that it's not just this. It's not about blaming women. It's not about, this being the fault of women, because men, by and large, pioneered therapeutic culture. I mean, so much of this stuff stems from Freud, and so it's not simply a matter of women in the workplace causing issues, or women in running HR departments or compliance offices, or causing a certain set of problems. It's about a certain way of seeing the world, that is more traditionally feminine than masculine, um, having supremacy in domains, where it shouldn't.
Which came first then, in your estimation, the female dominance of important industries or this feminized culture, right? Because I could see it going either
Hmm.
way. I could see, sort of a post-Freud world, and particularly an economy moving into a managerial phase of capitalism,
Hmm.
um, really favoring the risk averse, favoring the managerial, favoring and having certain sort of conditions that then make it. I don't know. I'm thinking here about an industry like HR, or a good one that's I think
Hmm.
totally female dominated largely is hospital administration, right?
Hmm.
Those jobs require or favor a set of skills that tend to be more feminine, and so I guess I'm asking you, which way did this go? In other words, did we have this kind of therapeutic cultural revolution in the 70s that consequently, combined with a longer term economic shifts, just make essentially female culture more competitive in a certain sense, and more valued,
Hmm.
and now do we therefore have, the 58% of degrees and so on going to women? Or is it the reverse, that having a certain number of women in these industries then feminized the culture to such an extent that men simply started kind of bowing out?
Yeah, I think it's the former, um, and I think that, certain deep structural changes, probably beginning in the Wilson era, um, and the emergence of the the managerial phenomenon, is probably the deeper culprit, and of course this, um, made it possible for women to be in the workplace in a new way. And this is in some ways good, and in other ways negative. Um, one of my favorite ways of thinking about this comes from Wendell Berry, um, and um, in his essay, "Feminism: The Body and the Machine." And he says something to the effect that um, this whole system has been pretty awful for men. Why would we expect it to get any better just because we let women experience these awful things as well, in this context. So if it's abusive of men, we're not going to make it better by letting it abuse women as well, if that makes sense. Just regarding to the whole capitalist system. Um, but I think that you know it's not. I mean, there might be kind of a clearer origin, of guilt, in the managerial system. But all these problems, which maybe you can think of them as latent problems, really get actualized, when the gender balance is in practice lopsided, and a certain character of the system becomes um, more deeply ingrained, more deeply constitutive. It's like, I mean, bureaucracy has been around for a long time. We don't think of Prussian bureaucracy as being especially feminine. So it's not like bureaucracy itself is necessarily profoundly gendered. Um, but I think in our case, it combined, maybe just serendipitously, with the emergence of the therapeutic. And the therapeutic served the interests of the managerial class to such an extent that it just got in, very much enshrined. Because when you think about it, if you're trying to minimize risk in an organization, and you're also trying to protect your own position, as a higher administrator, if you want to safeguard your own power, then de-emphasizing hierarchy, hiding the extent to which you do control things, um, and minimizing overt competition can protect your own ass. Um, and so there's this element of self-interest too that has driven it. And historically, this has been the self-interest of men. Um, anyway, so another way to think about this, if you want to make it even less about blaming women, is that this is the beta male hierarchy or patriarchy. Um, we have beta males, using feminine values in order to preserve their own standing.
The counterpoint to the example you gave, oh, nobody thinks of the Prussians as a feminized state. We do kind of think of the Byzantines that way, though, in juxtaposition to the Western Empire. We think of,
Mhm.
and perhaps unfairly, as sort of the softer, more decadent, less martial half of. Um, so that, and famously, they gave us the word Byzantine
Yeah.
as descriptive of bureaucracy. But it's true that, so I do think there's some kind of inherent link here, because a managerial system is necessary at a certain level of size, I think. So I'm not like a absolutist. I think there has to be, I mean, there has always been, quote unquote, an administrative state. I mean, Jefferson complained about Hamilton's Treasury Department being bloated. It was 23 people. Um, so there is a certain amount of administrative organization that is necessary. And in fact, one of the geniuses of America has been the ability to organize logistics in war, for example.
Mhm.
But it is also true that this kind of managerial or bureaucratic form distributes and makes, like, by its nature does distribute and make unclear the lines of accountability and responsibility, right? And
Mhm.
we always talk about the system now. We're constantly talking about things in terms of the system rather than personal responsibility. And it strikes me that that is very much part of the uh, feminized. I mean, it is a feminine mode of being in the way that is described in this Longhouse article, right? Which is
Mhm.
that lines of accountability and responsibility are of necessity sort of unclear in a bureaucracy because the whole
Mhm.
thing is so unwieldy. I mean, everybody has had that like frustrating experience of going to the DMV and then one worker, usually a woman, right, tells you, oh, you don't have the right form, and then you say, well, this other woman told me that this was the form that I
Mhm.
needed, right? Everybody's had that kind of um, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, or at least claims not to,
Mhm.
sort of experience with bureaucracy. So maybe there is something inherent about it. Um, to circle back to the questions at the top of the hour here, um, I guess what drew you to writing in the first place as one of these artists, as a man who's trying to escape the longhouse, whatever we want to, however we want to define this. What drew you to writing and to horror in particular as a way of making art?
Yeah, so, um, something I keep discovering with other writers is that, you don't choose writing, it chooses you. It becomes this kind of demonic compulsion, and, some writing mentors will go so far as to discourage people from becoming writers, because they know if you're supposed to be a writer, you're gonna write, um, and it doesn't matter what the world says to you, you have to do it. One of my college professors put it really well. He said that you know the only thing worse than writing is not writing, and um, and so there's this kind of compulsion to it, and I can't really account. I mean, I try to moralize or intellectualize my interest in horror, but at the end of the day, I watched Alien when I was too young to watch Alien, and it scared the hell out of me. And I fell in love with the monster, and the kind of powerful emotion that could be produced by this. I would draw, the xenomorph in the margins of my homework in elementary school and freak out my teachers. Um, and and I got a lot of delight out of that. It's just this perennial boyish impulse of, you find a toad and you come and you set it on someone's shoulder and they freak out, and that just feels wonderful. um, to be the person that brings that about. And so if I can do that to someone at an existential level, then the perverse delight is even deeper. Um, but um, Stephen King answered this question really well. He might have been stealing this answer from another writer, but he used to say, when people say, "So why horror?" He would say, "Well, I have the heart of a young boy. I keep it in a jar on my desk, and so it's like, it's true without the second half of the sentence, and it's even truer with it." Um, but I do think that moral, that horror is a powerfully moral genre. Um, I mean, postmodern horror tends to revel in ambiguity, but I think the most effective horror, um, has a very clear demarcation of good and evil, and it might have characters that are very gray, but but to have the kind of shadow that makes horror effective, you have to have a black and white world. And so, when you watch a well done horror movie, um, it's very likely to throw in relief, um, moral absolutes, in the way that Greek tragedy used to. Um, and I sometimes think of horror as, um, you know, a purified modern version of tragedy, even though it doesn't always have the tragic arc. So one example is my favorite recent horror movie is Hereditary, uh, by Ari Aster. Um, and it was just a phenomenal movie, about the disintegration of a family, and the whole movie is very, very intentionally structured like a Greek tragedy. And instead of the gods or the fates creating the impossible situation, it's demons. But the sense at the end, is the same, that that we're trapped in a particular way. Um, and as a Christian, I don't ultimately believe that, as being true of ultimate reality. But I do believe that experientially, that's often very much the case. That we seem to be trapped, um, and it seems that we're being compelled by forces outside of our control. And witnessing that, in a fictional context, does bring about catharsis in meaningful ways. Um,
Well, where can people go to find your work other than First Things, or you're an associate editor? Can you give us your Twitter handle, and then where people can read your short stories?
yeah, so my short stories are kind of all over the place right now, but you can find them on my personal website, which needs to be updated badly. Um, but Twitter handle is at Justin Dean Lee, Dean like James Dean. And that's my website as well, justindeanlee.com. And there's a fiction section that'll have links to all my published stories. And yeah, most recent one is at the magazine Return. It's return.life, and it's called Killshare. It's about an app that allows you to participate in political assassinations. Um,
That's seems just realistic to be horrifying, just like
yep,
close enough to us to be horrifying.
yep,
Justin Lee, thank you so much for joining High Noon.
yeah.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. Likewise.
And thank you to our listeners. High Noon with Inez Stepman is a production of the Independent Women's Forum. As always, you can send comments and questions to inez.stepman@iwf.org. Please help us out by hitting the subscribe button and leaving us a comment or review on Apple Podcasts, Acast, Google Play, YouTube, or iwf.org. That really helps with those algorithms. Be brave, and we'll see you next time on High Noon.